Chapter 6. Whose enemies are they? The reason William Casey and Oliver North were so insistent that I support them in Central America was clear. In the past, I had been quite effective in dealing with one of the toughest problems for U.S. intelligence: communication with Fidel Castro. My long, cordial relationship with Fidel Castro was not based on ideology. It developed as a result of request by the United States. I first met Castro as a result of Cuba's capture of two mercenary ships, the Johnny Express and the Layla Express, under the command of Jose Villa, a seaman of Spanish origin at the service of the CIA. Villa and his men sailed to the Cuban coast and staged a wanton machine gun raid on the resort town Balnearios, killing a score and leaving many wounded. When Cuban gunboats counterattacked and captured the two ships, they took Villa into custody. Both vessels flew the Panamanian flag. U.S. intelligence contacted General Torrijos soon after the capture of Villa and his men, hoping that Torrijos' friendship with Castro might help negotiations toward Villa's release. Castro and Torrijos had not yet met face-to-face. I was Torrijos' G2 intelligence chief, a lieutenant colonel at the time, and had not yet met the Cuban leader. Torrijos first tried normal diplomatic channels, citing the origin of the vessels, but was rebuffed. The Americans asked him to try again. I don't remember Torrijos' specific rationale for complying, but this was at the inception of the Panama Canal treaties, and helping out the United States on such a request seemed like a helpful and painless gesture of good faith. So he sent Romulo Escobar Bethencourt, a well-known diplomat who played a key role in the canal negotiations, on a special mission to meet with Castro in Cuba. Bethencourt, a friend of Castro, spent a month in Havana discussing the case with Cuban officials, and occasionally with Castro himself. Fidel rejected any possibility of releasing Villa. The guerrilla attack had outraged all Cubans. They were traumatized by the killing spree, the coldness of the crime, and unrepentant, bloodthirsty demeanor of Villa. Not surprisingly, Romulo came home empty-handed. The Americans insisted still more. They had to keep trying to get Villa back. They asked Torrijos to make one more try. This time, the CIA station chief said, send Noriega. At the time, not only did I not know Fidel, but I also had never been to Cuba and didn't know much about the issues involved. But there I was, on orders from Omar, bouncing along in a C-47 transport plane, on my way to Havana with two aides and a pilot, Alberto Purcell. At Jose Marti International Airport, we were cordially greeted by Manuel Pinheiro, the chief of the American section in the Foreign Ministry, known widely by his nickname Barba Roja, Redbeard. We spent our first day engaged in diplomatic niceties. We were housed in a diplomatic guest house in a picturesque setting along a lake. Our host took us around the city, showed us films about Cuba, served dinner, offered before and after drinks, more small talk, then a very cordial goodnight. The following day, it was the same routine. Breakfast, smiling host, tour of the environs outside Havana. This is all very courteous, and we thank you for your hospitality, I finally had to tell Pinheiro. But as I've told you, our specific and sole mission is to meet with the comandante, and that's what I have to do. Of course, yes, we know, we understand, no problem, Pinheiro and his aide said. Then we started more tours and more dinners and another round of drinks. It was clear we were in a classic Cuban holding pattern. I was getting quite frustrated that second night, and as I drifted off to sleep, I was wondering how much longer this could go on. Colonel, excuse me, but Fidel is here, said one of my aides, calling me after midnight. I quickly dressed and prepared to greet Fidel. There were presentations, protocol, and small talk. A good thing, because it took me some effort to shake myself awake. I do think that Castro's famous late-night entrance schedule was partly his method of catching people off guard, but was also simply consistent with his work regimen. This first encounter with Fidel Castro lasted until 5 a.m. 90% of the conversation was about Panama, with Fidel asking lots of questions. How do the locks of the Panama Canal work? What is everyday life like for Panamanians? Agricultural production figures, the methods used, the type of fishing, our governmental system, information about Torrijos. I interjected one point of my own, details of a trip he had made to Panama. It was in the 1950s, during the tenure of my brother's leadership in the Federation of Students. Luis Carlos had spent time with him during the visit and kept some snapshots of the two of them posing with another young visitor, Che Guevara, at the old Hotel Central in Panama City. Fidel had no memory of the specifics, but he did remember the trip. It reminded him of the old days, and it went a long way toward establishing a relationship. When I got back home, I sent him copies of the pictures. Far from the image painted by his opponents and detractors who wanted to portray him as crazed and distracted, Castro was easy to talk to. He spoke deliberately, listened, and enjoyed the banter of conversation. We spoke into the night, toasting with whiskey, then drinking coffee to keep going. Close to dawn, he stood up. "Very well. Tomorrow I'll come show you some of our housing projects. We'll take a little tour," he said. I remember looking at my watch. It was 4:47 a.m. "Comandante, just to remind you, I do have a specific mission from General Torrijos. I need to talk to you about Leila Express and—" "No, hombre, no," he said with a frown, cutting me off. "It is not possible that our relations, our communications have to be based on these miserable murderers who have killed children and innocent people and who deserve nothing more than death themselves because of the savage way they operated." He then launched into a rapid-fire diatribe about the guerrilla attack. "How is it possible that Torrijos could be asking me to hand over these murderers who have raised the indignation of all Cubans?" His visit had been an exercise in psychology. Catch your opponent off guard, actually sleeping in my case, set your own pace, parry and wait for his first move, then strike and leave him speechless. He had won this first round easily. All I could say was, "Okay, we can talk about it tomorrow." I slept for a few hours until, as he had promised, Fidel came around to pick me up at mid-morning along with his bodyguard. One could say that it was yet another tour, but with Fidel at the wheel of his own Jeep, it was a fantastic experience. There was nothing contrived about this day. It was spectacular. People would come running as they got a glimpse of us driving along, trailed very unobtrusively by a single car. Sometimes there would be spontaneous town meetings and gripe sessions. Fidel listened intently, no matter what the subject. "Let's go take a look at some of our projects," he said. We drove along easily, chatting amiably, stopping at construction sites, meandering from village to village. People crowded around. They were happy and friendly. Some had complaints against bureaucratic delays. A shipment of cement hadn't arrived on time, or a document promised for such and such a date wasn't in yet. Fidel would gesture to his private security right alongside him. A notation was made for follow-up later. Fidel was the perfect tour guide. He explained everything as we went along. We went to a livestock station, engaged in experiments to increase milk production. It seems there was a special cow that had been brought in from Canada, complete with comforting music and a beautiful stable. There was much talk, down to the smallest detail about the livestock, with the people that worked there. Always in good humor, but not falsely so. No polite laughter, just good-natured banter. The atmosphere was matter-of-fact. Again, Fidel steered the conversation, and I had no opening to discuss my mission. The only mention of Panama or Torrijos came when Castro wanted to make a comparison with what we were seeing. "What's cattle raising like in Panama? How many hectares of land do you have per cow?" were some of the questions I remember. "Well, I am not an agronomist or a rancher," I said, completely at a loss to come up with a good answer. "The only thing I can say is based on observation. We have a lot of land for grazing, all we need," I said proudly. "I would say that the ratio of cows to land is the maximum distance a cow can walk in a day as it grazes." He was taken aback. "But that can't be. If the cows walk so much, they grow lean and milk production suffers," Fidel said. "The theory is that too much grazing land for cattle cuts back on their capacity to fatten and produce milk." So much for my ability to match Fidel's expertise in farm production. We drove around all day, and he dropped me off at the guest house after nightfall. After the explosion at the end of our first encounter, I was not about to launch into a discussion of my mission. So, agreeing we would see each other the following day, I simply said, "Remember, Comandante, we have other things to talk about." "Tomorrow, Noriega, we can talk about that tomorrow," he said, waving his arm to dismiss the subject as he drove off into the night. At the guest house, I was reunited with the others in my group, who had gotten their own tours, each with a chaperone of his own rank and station. This was the case on all my trips to Havana. Other than dinners and public events, Fidel and I always met privately. That is Castro's style. That night we went to the Tropicana to see its famous cabaret show, with Pinheiro and his aides as our hosts. The following day was filled with meetings and lunch with government officials. We had told our host that this day was to be our last in Havana. We were leaving for home the following morning. The day wore on and Fidel was nowhere to be seen. At night, there was a dinner offered by Pinheiro at our guest compound. Unannounced, Castro arrived as the meal was about to start. It was a barbecue in the back garden by a pleasant swimming pool. Fidel took me on a tour of the place. The house had once belonged to the DuPont family, one of many expropriated buildings now used by the government for meetings and guest quarters. I told Fidel that I admired the decor and the artwork on display, an exhibition by Cuban artists. "Choose anyone you like and it's yours," Fidel said in a grand gesture, motioning towards the works of art. I thought for a moment and selected a painting, but one of Fidel's aides objected to what the boss was up to. "Comandante, you can't give this away. It belongs to the state," she said. "You can't give away any of these paintings. They are government property and part of our national collection." This was unexpected, since we were dealing here, supposedly, with what the Americans would call an autocrat, a dictator, a man who answered to no one. I wasn't certain what his reaction would be. Fidel's expression didn't change. He nodded to Celia, his aide, calling her aside for a second. "Don't worry," he said. "Celia's right. We can find you a similar painting by the same artist." They did just that. I was impressed and never ceased to recall this telling anecdote about a man and the power he wields. I thought about what I might have done in the same circumstance. It was an important lesson. After dinner, the hours were ticking away, and I was quite aware that unless I delayed our departure, this could be my last chance to win the release of Captain Villa. I was determined to keep my schedule. Protocol was fine, but I was not going to allow the rules of diplomacy to keep me in Cuba for a month, as had happened to Romulo Bethencourt. Fidel finally pulled me aside. He put his arm on my shoulder, and we went walking off alone to the far end of the swimming pool, opposite from where the barbecue pit was set up. "Okay, look, why does Torrijos want these guys?" Castro asked. "I can understand why he would want the ships, because they are Panamanian. But what can he want with these murderers? What relationship can he have with all of this?" "To tell you the truth," I said, "he wants them because the gringos have asked him to do it. They insisted. They said to do everything he can to get them out. At the moment, he is working on the diplomatic strategy for the Panama Canal treaties. We want to do so from a position of strength. This is the kind of thing that comes across as a request for good faith in these types of negotiations." "But who is behind it?" Fidel asked. "Who are the masters in this game?" "I don't know who they are," I answered. "Torrijos was contacted directly, but call it what you want. CIA, State Department, the military, it's the same thing. The Americans want these guys back." "The law requires that these men be tried, and everyone knows they're guilty," Fidel said. "They were caught in the act. These men are supposed to face the firing squad, and no one here will cry for them. Public opinion is indignant. They demand it. I wish you could have seen what it was like. They mowed them down, bodies of innocent people all over the beach, mothers, crying babies. He couldn't have chosen a more innocent location, a poor fishing village. No military, nothing. Poor fishermen and their families, and he just opened up with his machine gun." Castro continued with a series of arguments against the idea, talking about the terrorists, what they were like, their arrogance, the cold-bloodedness displayed by Villa in particular. "Not even a sign of remorse. If he had the chance, he would have killed 1,000 people. The indignation of the people who live there, the indignation of the people investigating the crime." "Yes, Comandante, I understand. I sympathize. We all understand this," I said. "But our request is based on a higher level, a political problem, and we think this will help change the balance. It is something that Torrijos needs badly. It shows the Americans his potential value when he comes to the negotiating table, that he's the man that has managed to do what no one else could have done." We went on talking for a while, and I still had no idea what the outcome would be. Suddenly, Fidel threw up his hands. "Listen, if you really want this piece of shit, take him. Tell Torrijos that he can have him." He called Pinheiro over. "Okay, set it up for Noriega to take this garbage back with him," he said, and he added a sardonic joke. "We don't want him to get shot for coming home empty-handed." Once Fidel had decided, that was that. He mentioned something about having some explaining to do to the Council of State, but there were two possibilities. He either had given up arguing with me or made the decision without consultation, as a gesture of good faith to Torrijos, or he had consulted ahead of time and was enjoying the arguments before announcing the decision he already had made. I never knew which. Either way, this was another lesson in power. We said goodbye to Castro right there at the guest compound. It was about midnight. By 5 a.m., we were packed and ready to leave. Cuban soldiers brought Villa as we arrived at the airport. We were taking our little package home with us, and I could see that he was an arrogant piece of work. As the Cubans brought him to the plane, they were cursing him, saying, "Son of a bitch, we hope you die of cancer." Things like that. Instead of keeping quiet, he was mouthing off back to them. "If I ever get back here, I'll have my machine gun ready for you," he sneered. "Try to come back and see what happens, you mother," one of the soldiers said. "Communist bastards." I'd had enough. I watched from the steps of the plane and was afraid that the Cubans were going to change their minds or shoot him on the spot. "Tape his mouth shut so he shuts up," I ordered my men as he reached the steps of the plane. Years later, the United States again asked me to intervene to win the release of a prisoner in Cuba. The top-secret case was even more embarrassing to the Americans. In 1984, during the first Reagan administration, the CIA under William Casey had sent Henry Pino, a Cuban-American pilot who worked at the Panama Canal, to take clandestine aerial photographs of the Soviet cosmonaut facilities in Cuba. Again, I sent word of our interest to Barbaroja. After several days of back and forth with Fidel, Pino was released. These successes brought other requests from various establishment figures for the release of political prisoners. Fidel never turned me down. That first contact with Fidel did what both sides had hoped. It cemented friendly relations between Cuba and Panama, gave Torrijos the immediate good faith gesture he wanted, and proved to the Americans that I was capable of getting the job done. It heralded the start of serious relations between Panama and the Cubans, all propitiated by the United States. After the auspicious beginning, I was usually the liaison. My contact with Cuba also lessened Cuba's isolation, whether with the Organization of American States or other countries, for which Panama could serve as a conduit or third party. It was a high-level relationship. Fidel and I were not trading secrets. My conversations with him were always political in nature, political analysis, political theory, and at times I had urgent requests from the Americans. The Americans knew that I often spoke to Fidel and that any subject at hand would be dealt with seriously and securely. For instance, when they wanted to send a secret envoy, as they once did in the person of former Deputy CIA Director Vernon Walters, I would tell Fidel outright, "The Americans want such and such," or "the CIA says such and such." There was no secret about where the request came from, and he would answer as he saw fit. During the Sandinista period, during the Central American Wars, Fidel and I spoke often. He was always concerned that the United States would invade Panama. He was always thinking about the number of soldiers the Americans had in Panama, the kinds of weaponry. He called it a kind of guillotine, permanently perched over Panama, that Panama was the headquarters of Yankee imperialism. He was, of course, comparing our situation with that of Cuba. There were similarities. But our first joint experience of an American invasion came with the U.S. attack in Grenada in October 1983. It was days after I formally had become commander of the Panamanian Defense Forces, succeeding General Rubén Dario Paredes. The contact came hours after the U.S. began landing its Marines on the beach in Grenada, where the Cubans had a military garrison and Army engineers building an airstrip and reinforcing the island. The United States had botched its invasion badly. It was laughable. They had no idea where they were. Some Marines had to use an Esso gas station map to find their way. Even though it was a small island, they got lost, and Washington was worried they would stumble upon an American medical university compound and start killing students by mistake. They wanted to scale things back, avoid bloodshed of American soldiers or pictures on television of students lying in pools of blood on the ground. The first of a series of phone calls came from Casey. A number of other people, including Vice President George Bush, were also on the line. Bush, as a presidential candidate years later, would at first try to say that he had never spoken to me, that he never participated in this series of contacts on Grenada. Eventually, faced with the facts, his limp memory would improve, and suddenly he would remember. The Americans asked me to open up a line of communication with Fidel. The message was this: "We have obvious superiority of forces over the Cuban contingent on the island. Please stay neutral. Don't engage with the arriving U.S. troops. It is impossible to win. There could be an escalation. Innocent civilians will be killed in the process." In retrospect, of course, this concern about innocent lives stands in stark contrast with the wanton killings of civilians during the invasion of Panama. I got in touch with Fidel, and we had perhaps 5 or 6 rounds of calls back and forth. First, I talked with the Americans, then to Fidel, sometimes alone, sometimes with other officials on the line. I made it clear to all of them that I was transmitting an official entreaty from the United States. Fidel knew this in any case, but I made it explicit, saying that the United States was reaching out to him through me, that it was not a trick or double dealing in any sense. It was a petition by the Americans because they wanted to save American students. Fidel was indignant and outraged. "Why the hell are they asking this stuff now, when my information tells me they're already attacking the island?" he said. "How are they going to ask for us to consider alternatives when they're already on the beach?" We went back and forth on this. Fidel's persistent answer was that it was too late to negotiate since the American troops were already on Grenada. He would make no commitment to the Americans. Nevertheless, when the time came, he took the hint. He didn't have that many men on the island, certainly not enough to repel an invasion, but enough to cause trouble, just enough to fight back, provoke injuries and death among the civilian population. Although he did not tell the Americans what his decision was, his position was obvious. He chose not to fight. The Cubans on Grenada did not raise their weapons. I am proud to say that my intervention with Fidel, without a doubt, saved the lives of American students that day. Grenada ended up being a precursor of the Panama invasion in miniature. The Americans could no longer tolerate Prime Minister Maurice Bishop. He had gone over the line. He was becoming friendly with Fidel Castro. He was expressing socialist ideas. He manifested a third world vision and would not listen to reason. So the Americans decided to eliminate Bishop. They called their invasion of Grenada a multilateral force, but this was a transparent subterfuge to justify their intervention. The blueprint for the invasion was much like that for the invasion of Panama. Plan an overwhelming attack, conspire to kill a leader, and blame it on his own countrymen. Pretend that you were doing it to restore democracy. In Panama, the plan was to kill me and blame it on the Panamanians. Bishop was killed, and that was the way it was going to be in Panama. Co-opted members of the defense forces would be goaded to kill me. Only in Panama, things didn't follow the entire script. I survived.